Welcome to the Wandiology podcast, where we learn and demystify astrology as a tool to gain a deeper understanding of our energetic signatures and our interactions with the world. Today, join me for a solo episode where we go through Gemini in the houses or through the houses. And we'll just jump right in to the first house, which again is an angular house, one of the most visible houses because it's a house of self. It's a house of how you are perceived. The first time you see someone, you're seeing the first house or the ascendant or the rising, right? So the rising sign marks the start of the first house, basically, right? So, for example, if you have 26 degrees Gemini rising, that means that marks the start of your first house. And so having Gemini, a sign that is ruled by Mercury, an air sign, a mutable sign, you get someone who is intellectual, someone who is sociable, someone who is clever, smart, someone who has quick movements, maybe even an androgynous person, because this is also very trickster energy because of Mercury. And it's kind of like trickster because you see how people say Gemini, the twins, and it could be kind of deceptive, right? Because they're so socially adept and they know exactly how to manipulate the social environments. So this could be a physical trickster, someone cunning, someone clever, someone youthful. Could also be someone who is superficial and gossipy because gossip falls under Gemini as well. Could be someone who really like fidgets a lot with their hands or like a knuckle cracker or like just something like that. Yes, so that's basically Gemini in the first house. It's giving intellect, it's giving sociable, it's giving trickster energy, it's giving androgynous, someone who you really, really can't figure out like that. So could also be someone who loves to give out nicknames or to is identified using many nicknames. Um, could also be someone who mimics people, right? Or an actual mimic, something like that. So, someone basically who can copy what they see into their own personality, right? And so that's Gemini in the first house. Then we move on to Gemini in the second house. The second house is has to do with value. It has to do with financial possessions, because remember it's a Taurian house, right? Or rather, it correlates with the sign of Taurus. And so, having Gemini here, you get someone who has flexible values, right? We know Gemini is a flexible sign, so they value adaptability and being flexible. They can earn a living through writing, right? A lot of writing. They can learn a living through being very clever and cunning, right? So, this could be someone who writes about finances, right? Things like that, a financial columnist or something like that. Then they also have very flexible survival needs. There's some the people who can kind of adapt their personality to get the material possessions they kind of want. Okay. Um, right. So it could end up even being through deceptive means. So you have to watch out for the cunningness that comes with the sign of Gemini, right? Because there is definitely trickster energy, just like Virgo, because they're both ruled by Mercury. Then, yes, that's the second house. And the third house um, deals with communication, coordination, right? Things like that. And so Gemini falls here naturally because it's a third sign of the zodiac. And having Gemini in the third house gives you a very incessant talker, someone who is always conversating, someone who borderline cannot stay quiet at times because they're just always having ideas running through their heads. So they talk a lot. there may be a tendency for even gossip, but in higher forms of communication, these are people who are exemplary writers. These are people who are bloggers and people who basically excel at communication. So that's Gemini in the third house. So moving on to the fourth house, which is also an angular house, right? And this is a house of home, right? Your private home environment. This is the house of your ancestry, your roots, right? And having Gemini here could mean you have an environment surrounded by very clever, witty people, light-hearted people, mischievous people, even. Maybe you live with writers, or you live in a writer's compound. Tendency for gossip within the family as well. A lot of Gemini energy, the lower form of communication, because Gemini is about communication, tends to do with gossip. So you have to watch out for that. Could mean like an unstable home life. Maybe you had to move a lot, even during your childhood, you're here, you're there. So things like that. It could also mean you write for publications about homes or about living spaces. Yes, and stuff like that. So it just has to do with the Gemini archetype within the home, right? And so just think of nervous, this very intellectual, nervous, kind of unsteady energy within the home. Then moving on to the fifth house. The fifth house ruled over play, it ruled over romance, it rules over fun, creativity, right? Things like art, things like dating. So having Gemini here, you have a very curious person, you have a very spontaneous person, someone who doesn't stick to the typical dogma of romance, right? So this is someone who probably has multiple dating partners, someone who probably doesn't want to stick to the one person. This is also someone who is mischievous when it comes to dating and things of the sort, right? And you get someone who probably leads people on with no intention of following through, right? Because this can give a very flirtatious person, but because Gemini energy is very here, there, it's like, okay, flirt, I'm done. Flirt, on to the next. Flirt, on to the next. And things like that. These are people who love playing with language. Probably they love crossword puzzles, things like that. Things to do with transportation, cycling, right? Skateboarders, because that's the Gemini archetype. It rules over like local community, but also that local transportation, right? So what do you do for fun? Do you skate? Do you walk? Do you jog? That's Gemini in the fifth house, okay? What do you do as well with your hands? Do you juggle? Do you do acrobatics? Things like that, right? That require coordination with your hands. And then we move on to the sixth house. The sixth house is the house of daily routines, of your work, like your daily habits at work, right? And so it's also about your health, okay? So this could be a very someone who eats very sporadically, okay? Like very maybe small meals, but a lot of meals throughout the day. Someone whose eating habits are like that. Gemini in the sixth is also about where you work on a daily basis. So, what that could look like is someone who works maybe in transportation, someone who's a writer, right, and things of the sort. But these people actually require to have grounding techniques because they're very spontaneous. So it's either you have like a daily routine that's here, there, I'm doing this, I'm reading right now, I'm cooking, I'm Yeah, so just watch out for how that energy can be utilized in a healthy way. Moving on to Gemini in the seventh house. The seventh house is all about the qualities you look for in your significant other. So, this could mean a witty, bright, clever partner, a talkative partner, a mischievous partner, a partner who's an amazing conversationalist, an intellectual partner. It also could mean a fickle partner, right? The other side of Gemini. You could marry a writer, or you could have a business partnership with a writer, something of the sort. You could also attract someone who has really great connections with people, or someone who is unfocused or scattered. Could be either or, right? So you could also marry someone who is very good with their hands, a handyman or a handy woman, right? And yeah, it's just giving um, intellect in your significant other, right? And moving on to Gemini in the eighth house. The eighth house is about your it's about secrets, it's about privacy, it's about other people's money. So that could mean debt, that could mean other people's finances, things like that. um and having Gemini, this intellectual sign here, it's a sign. It's I think Jeffrey Dahmer has this placement, and I know that's a very scary person to reference, but they did. And it can be a very manipulative placement, right? Because this is the ability to see people very, very deeply, to see other people's secrets, and to kind of like have a knowing of other people's secrets. These are people who could be very good at studying occult sciences, they could be very good astrologers, tarot readers, and things of the sort, because intellectually they're able to see through all these hidden things, right? Which are matters of the eighth house, okay? There are also people who are really good at analyzing finances, getting to the root of problems when it comes to finances, especially, right? Yes, that's what the eighth house is giving. But having Gemini here, it can be a very tricky kind of like trickster energy. So you have to be careful not to kind of manipulate people, okay? Because you know better, you literally know better. And then we move on to the ninth house, which rules over philosophy, religion, long distance travel, and things of the sort. And so it's kind of like being a know-it-all, having Gemini here. It's knowing a little bit of everything. It's kind of like studying from different cultures and from different like countries, and kind of like mimicking the things that you assimilate, right? And so it's incorporating those bits of other people's cultures into your life. It's being a philosopher, even publishing books about other people's cultures, um, assimilating other people's religions. And so it's having like a bit of everything and sampling a bit of everything. So with that, you need to make sure that your identity is grounded, right? You're just not mimicking everyone else's ideas, right? Know yourself and then learn and get inspired from all the other things, from all the other cultures, okay? And so we have Gemini in the 10th house, which is also an angular house. The fourth and the seventh as well are angular houses, and they're the most visible houses. The 10th house is about career, it's about public reputation, it's about your legacy, okay? And having Gemini here, it's this energy of like being a prolific writer, being known for writing, being known for being cunning or mischievous. You could be like a very famous writer, a very famous blogger, a very famous communicator, like a public speaker, right? And yeah, things like that. A motivational speaker as well. And you could do those things for career, or these things could be your calling. Things to do with your hands, right? Could be your calling as well. Anything to do with your hands, you could make a career out of that, or that could be your legacy. Moving on to the 11th house. So Gemini in the 11th house is about friend groups, it's about peer groups, it's about humanitarianism. So think about people who are always on the latest humanitarian trends, could be consistent or very much inconsistent, having Gemini here, because Gemini is kind of like a very nervous energy. So think about book clubs, people who come together to read, right? Or writing clubs, even friends who are stimulating conversationalists. This is also networking over the internet. So I personally have Gemini in the 11th, yes. And so these are people who are very tech savvy. They have a very wide group of friends. They could be inconsistent in their friendships, though, because Gemini energy is scattered, but they have a wide network of friends because they're charming and they're witty and they're clever and intellectual. So, could also mean an inconsistent way of reaching your goals. So you have to also make sure you're centered in your long-term goals. Okay. Could represent an element of trickery in friendships, an element of mischief, right? Not knowing who you could really trust and things of the sort. So moving on to Gemini in the 12th, the final house. The 12th house rules over the subconscious. So it's the private things, it's the hidden things, it's mental health, it's hospitals, where you go to be isolated. And so having Gemini here, it could give a superficiality, an inconsistency, a gossiping tendency, and you have to be very careful because these qualities might be hidden, right? So could be a scattered mind, which is your undoing. A lot of times the 12th house is your own self undoing. So you could secretly love games and things like that. Spending time in like maybe facilities, hospitals, mental health areas and things like that. You also have to be very attentive with your mind and taking care of your mind and making sure your mental health is up to par, and just be quite grounded with that. And especially if you have placements here, you just have to be careful about getting pressure from ideas, right? Make sure you have grounding techniques. This is the message I'll keep saying to Gemini placements. Make sure you're grounding yourself. Make sure you're not taking in too much that you can't handle. Okay? Yes, and that's Gemini in the 12th. And so thank you so much for watching. You can follow me on at Wandiology on all socials, and at the Wandiology podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and YouTube. And I'll see you in the next episode, which will be the Cancer archetype. Bye. Say my name, I'll rip it down.
go.